My name is Ken Harris. I was in the United States Marine Corps in Korea during combat. Serial number 1041918.
Tell us about boot camp.
I was going to college, and I joined the Marines in 1948 as a reservist. And then in 1950, June of 1950, the Korean War started. And in October of 1950, got a letter from the President of the United States reporting that I had to report for active duty in Washington, D.C. at the Naval Yard. I think it was October 31st, 1950. And from there, I went to boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina. And I went through the basic boot camp experience that Marines go through at Parris Island. I was in a tent all the time. There was no room in barracks. And the boot camp experience ended about mid-January, and then I was transferred to Camp Pendleton, California for further infantry training. My MOS, military occupational specialty, was an infantryman at that time. So I went through the infantry training at Camp Pendleton until about May of 1951, and then I was assigned to go overseas to Korea, got on board a troop ship with approximately 5,000 other Marines, and spent about 2 weeks crossing the Pacific Ocean. And the ship, it was a general type ship. That means it had 3 smokestacks, and the ship went on a zigzag trail course throughout, going across the Pacific, landed in Japan, spent a few days there at Yokohama, Japan, and then over to Busan, landed at Busan, and got off. Had an experience on board the ship. The military occupational specialties were all called out for all 5,000 troops because there had been a lot of casualties in Korea. And they had to reassign everybody. So my name came up on the loudspeaker, and I was reassigned to the artillery. I had never had any artillery experience whatsoever. And that sounded very good to me. I was pleased to hear it. I knew what to expect if I was in the front lines of Korea. And then it landed at Busan, and they said everybody's MOS, military occupational specialty, is subject to change. So 5,000 troops were put into a huge parade ground in Busan, Korea, and then the loudspeaker came on and everybody's name was called, and then their new assignment. Well, I was apprehensive. I thought for sure I was going back to the infantry. Well, lo and behold, my name was called out, and I was still assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, 1st Marine Division, artillery. I was very, very pleased about that. In Busan, I boarded a DC-3 with full military, everything one has to have: backpack, blanket roll, pup tent, M1 rifle, ammunition, and flew maybe 100 miles or 150 miles to about Central Korea. And I got on the way, then we were taken off the plane, and then we were put into a 6x truck. And on the way to the front lines, I could hear the artillery in the background and the explosions, and I got nervous. And on the way, there was a lot of wounded Marines that were placed in the trucks going the opposite direction to Busan. And when I saw that, I got really nervous because you could see they were all bandaged up, and I knew this was not a game. This was serious business.
Before you go ahead, why don't you swivel your chair just a little bit this way, because sometimes you have a tendency to look way off.
Okay.
And it just looks a little better this way. All right.
I spent, when I got off, when I was in the six by truck, we had to stop somewhere, and I spent one night in the pup tent. Heard this artillery fire going on all night long. Got up the next morning.
We're going to have to stop here.
Where he was talking about spending the first night there, kind of pick up there because it'll lead into what we're going to.
I'm rolling.
I spent the first night sleeping in a pup tent, and I could hear the artillery pieces in the background, front lines going off, and obviously that made me very nervous. Got up the next morning, got on the truck again, and then we were driven to our respective outfits, and I was landed at the 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, which was an artillery outfit. Major comes up to me and he says, "Ken, we have 2 positions we could use you at. One was an administrative position to the major, and another one was working with a survey group to survey in gun installation sites. And when you do that, you have to, you have to determine the altitude, you have to determine the exact coordinates of the gun position, so you know exactly where every gun position is located. And the 11th Marines had 18 guns. They were 105 howitzers. So I decided I would I'd work with the survey group. I didn't feel that being an administrative aide was too exciting when I'm in a combat area. And that job, we were moving about every other day up towards the 38th parallel. And as you probably know, historically, the 38th parallel was the dividing line that more or less was established by the United Nations. And incidentally, this was a United Nations war. The United Nations made a declaration of war against North Korea, and there were probably 25 nations that provided troops in Korea. Anyway, the specific operation of the survey team was to go out and survey these sites for the guns, and that was somewhat dangerous because of landmines and bouncing betties, which was like a grenade. You hit a tripwire with your foot, tripped over it, and a bouncing betty came up about 4 feet and exploded. And fortunately, I never got wounded from any of that, but we did have a captain that tripped over a wire and lost part of an eye and an arm and what have you. So I did that in Korea for about 4 months, went through the winter of 1951, very, very cold. We were in central Korea, in the mountains. It's a very mountainous area. Korea is a very mountainous country, except for the coastlines on the west coast and the east coast. Then after that, after what happened, there was an experience where one of the fellows that computed fire missions for the artillery made a calculation and probably put in short rounds, so you didn't put in enough powder, order enough powder for the projectile to hit the target, hit the North Korean target. And by that time, I want you to know that the Chinese had entered the war and crossed the Yalu River, and they came by the hundreds of thousands of people. So the major comes to me and he says, Ken, we'd like you to, this fellow that first of all, he Marine miscalculated a round of 6 105 millimeter artillery shells hit our troops in the front line. So the fellow that did that calculation was pulled off the job. Major came to me and he said, Ken, we want you to go and do these calculations. And I had never done any of that before, so I went in there and learned on the job, and I was very careful. I double-checked all my calculations because I did not want to have the same experience that Marine had. Of course, and I did this for maybe 7 or 8 months, and during the course of that time, my battery, was in charge of six guns, and my battery did have short rounds, but if you had one short round and the other 5 artillery pieces hit the target, you knew it wasn't your fault because the message got through to 5 gun locations and one made the mistake. Anyway, I did that, and then the entire Marine Division in March of 1952 was relocated north of Seoul. And we had to get in these trucks and drive all day, all night long over to our new positions and get set up. We drove through Seoul on the way, and Seoul was a city that was absolutely devastated. The railroad station, I remember it vividly. Everything was destroyed. There wasn't much left of anything because it had previously been in a lot of combat. When the Marines entered the country, they made an invasion at Incheon and went through Seoul and then went all the way up to the Yalu River on the north. And then the Chinese entered and, of course, pushed all the way back to the Busan perimeter.
The logistics was interesting to me about the complication in trying to relocate these 105s. You haven't talked about the danger involved in the DMZ area. You haven't talked about Hamburger Hill or what is it? Guadalcanal stores?
Punch Bowl.
Okay. Can you?
Okay, well, what happened as a result of negotiations between the United Nations and the North Koreans and the Chinese, a DMZ zone was eventually set up sometime maybe during late 1952 or 53, and that DMZ zone was a demilitarized zone. Both sides agreed to do that, and that DMZ was filled with landmines and barbed wire on both sides, and North Koreans had it, we had it, and the front line stayed there. It tended to stabilize front lines. There was a lot of propaganda from the north. They had loudspeakers firing messages across the DMZ to American troops and attempting to politically persuade the military that this was the wrong place and the wrong time and the wrong military action, et cetera, et cetera. And then when I was released from active duty, for many, many years, I was disappointed with my experience in Korea because I didn't feel we had accomplished anything. And then subsequently, South Korea developed into a democratic country, and capitalism became prominent in that country. And as you know, they have major corporations there today like Samsung and Daiwa and Hyundai, and the country has been redeveloped, and it's today a magnificent country, and so I changed my opinion, and now I feel, and I have felt that way for quite some time, that my experience over there was entirely worthwhile. The
You want to tell us about, you really haven't still mentioned Hamburger Hill. You
okay,
haven't
during,
mentioned-
right,
You haven't mentioned casualties.
okay, the Korean War, you'll see several numbers on that. The Korean War lasted from June of 1950 to the summer of 1953, and overall there was about 55,000 military people killed, but all of those people were not killed in combat. Of those, about 35,000 were actually killed in combat in Korea. And that's over a period of, I don't know, 2.5 years. Pork Chop, or the Punch Bowl, I'm sorry, the Punch Bowl and Hamburger Hill were very, there was a lot of combat in that area. And I remember one hill, we called it 1051, and the Army and the Marines and other outfits got together, and all of our artillery pieces were directed at the Punch Bowl and a hill in that area, and to win that particular combat event. And Hamburger Hill was about the same. There were many Marines who were lost in both of those in combat, in the infantry. Now, the artillery, in terms of a combat position, we had artillery battles. We would attempt to locate the North Korean artillery positions. They would attempt to locate our artillery positions, and then once they were located, then you'd get involved in these artillery battles going back and forth. We're talking about large shells. I mean, the shell was about that big, and then it had a missile projectile about the same length. So you're dealing with a very sizable projectile and shell, the powder. And of course, the powder charge goes into the shell, and the powder charge varies. You could put 3 bags of powder, 5 bags of powder, and that determines how far the projectile would go. The 105 howitzers, our range was about 7 miles. We could fire a projectile about 7 miles. But Punch Bowl and Hamburger Hill were historic battles during the Korean conflict.
Weren't you invited by Korea?
Oh,
You want to tell
yes,
us? That's
yes.
very interesting.
About 5 years ago, the Korean government, I'm in what's called the Korean War Veterans Association. The Korean government, South Korean we're talking about, invited me back to Korea, all expenses paid. And I returned, and the government, the South Korean government, paid for all expenses, and then that's your airline flight, the hotel reservations, the meals, and traveling throughout the city of Seoul. We were in Seoul, and then we went up to the Panmunjom, and that's where the treaty was signed between the North Koreans and the South Koreans, China, and got to see that. And it was still in existence. The DMZ line is still there today. Some 50 years later, it's still there.
Was this
so-
touching that they invited you back? Did it get to you a little bit?
Well, yeah, you have to understand, when I was there, the country was devastated when I left. And then you can imagine what artillery pieces and tanks can do to the countryside. I mean, there's nothing there. Just if you had a forest there, it was gone. If you had a city there, it was completely destroyed. And going back and seeing the development of Seoul, when I was there, they had one bridge that was blown up by the Marines that crossed the Han River. And the Han River is a river that goes through Seoul. Today, they have 17 bridges across the Han River. They have skyscrapers and parks and subways and freeways and everything any major city in this country has. And during that trip, why the Korean government, South Korean government, recognized the Marines that were there and passed out a lot of reward medals and commendations and what have you. And it was more or less an appreciation for our service to their country. So I felt real good about that. And I left a few friends over in Korea that didn't make it back, and that was hard.
I thought that was very good myself, but.
I've got a few questions here.
If we ask questions, like, still talk to John.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you do that? That's kind of tough, but you're gonna hear it over here, but watch me.
It's easy.
That's fine.
Okay.
But, you'd mentioned that the range of your howitzers, the 105s, were what, 7 miles?
Right.
How close typically were you to the front lines and to the? He can look at me when I'm asking the question.
Oh,
Don't
he
worry
can?
about that, so.
Oh, okay.
No, yeah. But how close? Typically, how close were you to the front lines?
I would say we were anywhere from 3 to 7 miles. It varied because, as I said, we would relocate these guns, and the logistics of relocating 18 105 howitzers and all the ammunition and all of the support that goes with an artillery. It was a mammoth job, but after you do it a few times, you get used to it and you get more proficient in it, and you just take it. I mean, you may spend all day getting things packed up and preparing for the move, and then you go at nighttime and get to your new location. And then the next day you have to set up your guns, set up your fire control center, set up all of the support functions that support an artillery operation. There was an interesting experience I had with, I went to the front lines as a forward observer, and I did that for maybe a week, and that was part of my training, more or less, to find out what I had to do in calculating fire missions for the artillery. I got to see the Chinese, North Koreans out in their environment, and it was strange because you'd see them outside of their bunkers, and they lived in bunkers, but they'd be walking around, washing or talking to each other or eating, doing the things that normal people do. And we'd call in a fire mission, and we always called for one shell to be fired from one of the guns for positioning to see where the shell was going to land. And then from that point, we'd make adjustments. We'd go up 50 yards, go down 50 yards, maybe left 100 yards, whatever it might be. We'd fire these missions and into these positions, and the enemy, the Chinese and North Koreans, wouldn't even move. It was the strangest thing at times. Now, I guess they got so used to the bombardment of all these shells, and I can tell you that the number of shells that were fired was just astronomical. I mean, just thousands of shells fired at the enemy.
How many rounds would it typically take for you to dial in a position like that? And
Well,
were you just communicating back and forth via radio or something with the
Yeah.
battery?
The communication was, we had double communication. It was, we had wires, telephones that went back and forth with the forward observers and with our gun sites, our gun installations. And these wires would get broken from time to time just by shells landing and what have you. And then the wiremen would have to go out and string up these wires all over again. That was a dangerous job because there were landmines everywhere. And then there was radio. We did have radio contact too, but the radios during that era were not the best. I mean, but nonetheless they did operate, and that's kind of the way we worked. It was a double communication channel.
When you were a forward observer, were you basically at the front lines, or did you have to go kind of in front to get your observation?
Oh no, you're at the front lines, and the way the forward observers worked in those days, they'd have two positions. There'd be, call it position A and position B, and they knew the distance between these two positions, and they would then have their transits, and they would turn, and then they could develop the angles to figure out where they wanted to go, and from that they'd call in the coordinates of the target, and that's how it worked. It was somewhat crude, but it did work. Today the artillery operations are much more sophisticated with GPS operations and so forth.
You wish you had something like that back then?
Oh, of course, it would have been wonderful to have GPS. The GPS, you know, they can put them on artillery shells today, and they can pinpoint the exact position of the target. If they know the coordinates, that's where that shell is going to go.
When you had the artillery duels with the North Koreans, were they very effective at honing in on your position?
Yes, they were. That doesn't mean they were effective each time one of these battles occurred, but once they found the general location of our artillery pieces, they were able to sight in on the artillery locations, and then these shells would come in, and the Marines that were manning these artillery positions were in the open, more or less. We had a grader would come, and these guns were down in holes, more or less, but when these shells came in, we had any number of the Marines were injured or wounded and killed who were on the guns. And where I happened to be in the Fire Control Center most of my time in Korea, the fire control centers were always located in a place where they felt they had the most projection, and that would have been on, let's say, the north side of a canyon, because the projectiles would, in order to hit the fire control center, the projectile would have to go very high and then come in and hit on the reverse slope where we were. But we did have a few that came very close, and we did have some rounds that killed some Marines that in the general area, not in my specific area, but in the general area, support area of the artillery operations.
I'm curious to know, do you happen to know how they come about to call this hill 1051 and this one 831?
Yes, I do. The hills were identified by meters. For example, 1051 would mean 1051 meters high. That's the elevation of the hill, and every hill topographically had a number. They knew the elevation. You know, they knew how high these mountains were, and you have to understand we're starting at sea level, and if you go up 1051 meters, that's a little over maybe 3,300 feet, so it's quite a climb. And Korea is a country that's very mountainous in the center of the country, and the only flat parts of the country are on the east coast, the west coast, and then the southern part of South Korea, where Busan is, and north of that. That tends to be very agricultural location.
I have a question. We hear so much about the weather in Korea, the cold weather, and how did that affect how you were able to move your artillery pieces around?
Well, it was very cold in the wintertime, and I think my recollection is the temperature would get down to about 50 degrees below freezing. And it was really very cold in the mountains. And when it is cold, things move a lot slower. Trucks have to start, people move slower, they're not real fast. I don't think, to my knowledge, I don't think it really affected the operation of the howitzer guns. They tended to, if you got one fired, just the explosion would probably heat up the barrel of the gun, but it was very cold. Food was cold, sleeping was cold, and I can remember on occasion I had to use 2 down sleeping bags plus a wool liner, plus sleeping with all my clothes on and a hat, a wool hat. It was very, very cold. But you just learn to live with that, and you work your way through it. And of course, when the spring comes, you're really happy.
Did you lose many troops to frostbite and the cold that had to go back?
Not in my organization, we didn't. I don't think we had any frostbites where I was located. Just the wounded from artillery pieces, and some were killed too. We didn't have that many, but if you're on the front lines, it's a different story, you know. If you're
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, if you're on the front lines, you sleep. You know, you're in the mud, you're in bunkers, you're in trenches. You eat C rations, K rations, and you have to. You know, you make assaults on enemy positions, and some of those are made at night. And of course, the Marines were. One of the things they did very, very often, they'd send out patrols of maybe 10 people, and they'd go out into enemy territory trying to just do reconnaissance to see what was out there, and then come back. And every once in a while, of course, they would run into the enemy. And but living on the front lines was very, very difficult, and quite, as I said, it's very hilly, mountainous, and the trees and the shrubs and everything is gone from the top of the hill. It's just bare, and all you see are a few the branches broken off. Very, very difficult. We did have one experience that was sort of strange. This one fellow when I was up there during this week at the forward observer position, one of the fellows got hit by a bullet, and he had a leather strap across his chest, and that bullet hit here, and that bullet bounced down on the ground. He picked it up, and that was kind of ironic. It must have been a sniper or something, but it was a very long shot. It didn't penetrate. So he was lucky to be around the next day.
You talked about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Chinese. Did you come close to being overrun by Chinese troops at any time?
No, we did not. We did not, because I think the North Koreans and the Chinese and the United Nations were in negotiations to attempt to come to a resolution for a good part of that time. So we didn't have, for my first 3 or 4 months over there, then we were moving to the north, and when I got there, we were in central South Korea, and we had moved up north of the 38th parallel, not too far north, but then the orders came down from the command centers that we're going to establish permanent locations. And then the last month I spent in Korea, there was some thought that the Chinese were going to attempt to retake Seoul. So the Marines were moved over north of Seoul, about 30 miles north. And then I went over there, stayed there for a month or 6 weeks, and then was rotated back home. In April of 1952, I was rotated home and had to travel through Seoul. Went to Seoul, was put on boxcars, maybe 50 Marines to a boxcar, and then went to Incheon, and the harbor at Incheon is a harbor that where the tides go in and out, and the difference in the depth of the water is unbelievable. The tide water is there, and we had to get on these boats and go out to a smaller ship, climb up rope ladders, get on the ship, and then we went to Japan, stayed there a few days, and then we got back on the same ship that I had traveled over to Korea on. It was a General William Weigel. Got on that ship, went to San Diego, and I stayed in San Diego for San Diego Recruit Depot, Marine Corps Recruit Depot. Stayed there for about a month, went through a process of being released from active duty. We were treated very well by the Marines who were permanently stationed there. Prior to getting on the ship to go home, we had to go through a delousing process where you take your clothes off and they spray you with all this stuff, chemicals to kill any lice you might have. And we had to take pills for worms. Went through all of that. Anyway, got released from active duty. I was still in the Marine Corps Reserve, and got a nice check from the Marine Corps because I had accumulated my pay when I was in Korea. When you're in Korea, you use script. You don't use American money, you use military script to buy things.
I guess one last thing, once a Marine, always a Marine. How do you think the Marines are doing even through today in Iraq and how they've kept going?
Well, I think anything I say along those lines are probably going to show my bias, but you're right. Once a Marine, always a Marine.